At the company party, I just watched. There was music, colorful lights, laughter mixed with the sound of clinking glasses, and I, standing by the bar, watched the world spin as if I were no longer part of it. My eyes fixed on that specific scene, as if life had frozen for me and accelerated for others. There, right in the middle of the room, among so many colleagues and strangers, was she, my wife, dancing with her boss as if it were natural, as if it were allowed. She was smiling. Not a light, social smile. It was the smile only those who have been loved can recognize. It was the smile that was once mine. And I, leaning against the wall, holding a glass that I no longer knew whether it was whiskey or shame, felt the world crumble beneath my feet. I walked toward them, not to argue, but because I needed to understand. My steps were slow, almost tripping over the pride that still tried to keep me upright. I got closer and saw him say, looking at her with an intimate glint in his eyes, "I'm just dancing, don't worry about it," and then he kissed her on the cheek, a quick gesture, but too intimate to be innocent. And it wasn't. I knew right then. The way she didn't pull away, the way she smiled after the kiss, the way she didn't look me in the eye. I knew. Afterwards, alone, my voice already choked and my heart broken, I said what I had been carrying in my chest for months without knowing, "Tell me now what is between you two. This is never something between friends, this is a couple thing," and she, without beating around the bush, without hesitation, simply said, "We are having an affair." The ground disappeared. The noise of the music, of the people, of the world, vanished. It was like being underwater, screaming and no one listening. I didn't cry there. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just stayed quiet. Because silence is sometimes the loudest scream there is. I returned home alone. She stayed. The next day, not knowing what to do with so much pent-up emotion, I wrote a letter. Just one page, but it carried everything I couldn't say out loud. I left it on her bed. "Be happy, whoever you are with, know that I always gave my all for you." And I left. For months, I lived among the rubble of a collapsed house. No one knows what it's like to be alone until they've lived in the silence of a house where love once lived. I questioned myself, blamed myself, tried to find the exact point where I was no longer enough. Why had she traded all that for an affair? What hadn't I seen? What had I missed? Life went on, but in slow motion. Every corner of the house smelled of her. Every morning, an emptiness beside the bed. Every coffee, a silence that screamed her name. But time, it doesn't heal, but it teaches us how to live with it. A few months later, I met someone. Without plans, without expectations, without looking. Someone who arrived slowly, respecting each of my silences. She didn't try to fix me. She just stayed. And little by little, between calm conversations and shy laughter, something inside me began to reawaken. It wasn't the same love. It was different. More serene. More conscious. I was relearning to love, without rushing. That's when she came back. My ex-wife. The same one who destroyed everything with one choice. She came to me with tears in her eyes and an expression that mixed regret and longing. She said she'd read my letter hundreds of times. That for a long time, she hadn't understood the value of giving one's all for another. That now she knew. That the true love I offered was unique, rare, pure. That her boss was nothing more than an inflated ego who made her feel desired when she felt invisible. That, in truth, she never stopped loving me, she just didn't know how to protect that love. I listened to it all. In silence. And when she finished, waiting for me to hug her, to say, "Let's try again," I smiled. A light, mature smile, full of gratitude. And then, calmly, I said I forgave her. Because yes, I did. But now, we were on different paths. Not out of revenge. Not out of pride. But because the love that once existed no longer fit there. She cried. A lot. She tried to reason with me. She said she loved me, that things were different now, that she'd make things right. But the difference between regret and true love is time. She missed it when she lost it. And me, well, I just learned to move on. The most impactful moment happened days later. When she showed up, unannounced, at my old apartment. I wasn't there. But she let herself in. The doorman let her up, perhaps on impulse, perhaps out of habit. And it was there, in the silence of my new home, that she found a box. A box of letters. Letters I'd written during our marriage. Never delivered. Never read. Some written after arguments. Others on birthdays, anniversaries. All with words so heartbreakingly sincere. Love, pain, hope, frustration. Letters in which I begged for connection, for presence, for care. She read them all there, sitting on the living room floor. Weeping silently. Finally understanding how much she was loved. How much someone tried to fight for her even when all seemed lost. And there, between those pages yellowed with pain, she understood the cruelty of her own mistake. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the negation of everything anyone could have done for her. Since then, we've gone our separate ways. I've been relearning how to live, how to trust, how to love. She's been learning to live with the pain of having traded love for ego. But what she never knew, what no one ever knew, is what was written in the last letter in that box. The letter I wrote the night she confessed everything. The only one that wasn't torn, crumpled, or stained with tears. It was short. One line. A single line that, to this day, no one has ever read. And if she had known what was written in that last letter, would everything have been different? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we do not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths about the real consequences of infidelity. Our purpose is to show how betrayal it tears apart bonds, destroys homes and forever marks those who truly love. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a reality check. Good listening. His name was Daniel, hers was Laura. They had lived together for 5 years, but had known each other for over 8. The beginning of their story was almost accidental, an unpretentious meeting in an old bookstore, two strangers who, over a book with a torn cover, struck up a conversation too long to be forgotten the next day. Daniel was a rare man these days, a man with a calmness in his eyes and a gentleness in his hands. He worked as a freelance editor, spending much of his day immersed in writing other people's stories, and editing, but he always took time to cook for her in the evenings, or simply lie beside her and listen to her voice recount the day's trivialities. He didn't talk much about himself, but when he did, his words carried deep meaning. Laura was the complementary opposite, intense, spontaneous, expressive. He had an easy laugh and a sparkle in his eyes that lit up any room. She was a communications manager at a fast-growing company, full of goals, events, deliveries, and even though she lived at a different pace than Daniel, she found refuge in the gentleness he offered amidst the chaos she faced daily. The house they lived in was small, but it bore traces of both in every detail, a bookshelf of old books filled with his notes, paintings of inspirational quotes she'd chosen, plants scattered in corners that Laura insisted on tending, even forgetting to water them sometimes, and a kitchen with recipes stuck to the fridge with travel magnets. It was there, between his carefully prepared coffee and her improvised dinners, that the couple's routine was built. It wasn't a perfect relationship, and they never claimed it was. There were silent arguments, moments when the silence was louder than any scream, and periods when they slept facing away from each other, but there was always a sincere attempt to return to center, to find the other amidst life's chaos. Daniel always said that love was persisting through the difficult parts. Laura believed that love was feeling alive, whole, desired. In the early years, they made a point of meeting at the end of the day, even if it was just to watch a random episode on the cramped living room couch. He would turn off his computer before 8, she tried not to bring work home, though she didn't always succeed. There were texts throughout the day, little notes hidden in the closet, silly surprises on random dates. He would write down dates when she said something important, like the day she cried in the car on the way home from work, and buy flowers that same day the following year. She, in turn, would make playlists with songs that reminded her of moments they had, and play them during dinner. They had their differences, but they learned to walk the tightrope that sustains couples who truly try to love each other. Over time, Laura's career began to demand more of her. The company grew, and so did she. New responsibilities arose, more frequent travel, late-night meetings, and an invitation to lead a key team preparing for a major project. Daniel was always supportive. He was the first to encourage her, even when their schedules clashed, even when dinners were replaced by quick, "I'll be late today," messages. He understood, or at least claimed to. He was still there, making dinner, keeping the house tidy, and listening to the stories she enthusiastically told whenever something new happened at work. He knew every name of her colleagues, who liked whom, who was more difficult, who was up for a promotion. He listened, absorbed, even when he felt he was slowly becoming a mere spectator in her life. Laura was proud to have him. She often told her friends that Daniel was her safe haven, that she could never imagine anyone else by her side. And it was true. There was a genuine affection between them, an intimacy built over time, with shared scars and small everyday gestures. But their rhythm began to slip. She would come home later, exhausted. He tried to talk, but the conversation would die halfway through. Their nights together became fewer, their touches became more spaced out, their glances less lingering. She began to fall asleep first, he woke first. The bed was no longer a space for connection, but rather for disguised distance. Daniel began to notice the signs, but said nothing. He thought it was just a phase, that everything would return to normal. Laura, on the other hand, found herself increasingly involved with the world outside the home. The work excited her, the challenges fulfilled her, and the time that had previously been divided between her and Daniel was now consumed by spreadsheets, reports, and meetings with people who made her feel valued. Among these colleagues, there was one in particular who demonstrated an interest that went beyond the professional. It was subtle, elegant, a charm Laura tried to ignore, but which moved her in ways she couldn't explain. They began talking frequently, exchanging messages after hours, sharing inside jokes, confiding in her about the stresses of daily life. Nothing explicit, nothing inappropriate, yet. But enough to ignite something inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something she didn't want to admit. Daniel, even without proof, felt it. Instinct speaks before reason. He began to notice small absences of attention, half-spoken sentences, a kind of lightness she brought when talking about work that no longer existed when talking about home. But instead of confronting her, he tried to fill the void with presence. He tried to restore the sparkle in her eyes with surprise dinners, with coffee left on her bedside table, with longer hugs. But the effort, when not reciprocated, takes its toll. Laura wasn't a bad woman. She was just confused. Conflicted with what she felt, with what she believed was right, with what she desired. There was no malice in her actions, only neediness, and a need to be seen. The problem is that, often, when we're not seen inside our homes, we seek light outside. Even if that light comes with shadows. Daniel, for his part, struggled internally with a feeling of helplessness. He watched the woman he loved drift away, watched the hours pass without that tight embrace they once had, and yet he remained there, steadfast, believing it was just a phase. Because he loved. And when you truly love, you try as hard as your soul can. And so the days passed. Their relationship grew alive with fond memories and hopes for the future. The connection of the present was lost amid the silence, the absence, the cold routine. They still said, "I love you," but out of habit. They still slept in the same bed, but in different worlds. They still shared the same roof, but no longer shared the same dreams. It was as if they lived on different floors of the same house. She continued to smile at work, he continued to try to keep alive the flame of a love that already burned brighter in one heart than the other. The company party was coming up soon. Laura mentioned it several times, excited about the event, the important names who would be there, and how much it meant to her career. She invited Daniel, of course. She said it would be good, that he needed to get away for a while. And he went. Because even though it wasn't the kind of environment he felt comfortable in, he wanted to be close to her. He wanted to see her shine. He wanted to try, once again, to remind himself and her that they were still together, even if the world around him seemed to say otherwise. That night, everything seemed normal. Laughter, formal greetings, ambient music, well-decorated tables. Laura was beautiful. He watched her from afar with the same enchantment as when he first saw her. But there was something in the air. An atmosphere he couldn't explain. Something about to change. Something he didn't yet understand, but which, deep down, he already felt. And it was there, that night, amidst toasts and promises, that life began to turn a page that could never be undone. Daniel arrived at the party without great expectations, but with a glimmer of hope. He was wearing a navy suit Laura had once complimented, the same one he'd worn to her birthday dinner 2 years earlier. The room was well lit, with tables decorated with white and gold flowers, soft background music, and a cocktail served by waiters who moved with precision. Laura greeted him with a quick smile, a hug too tight for someone she loved and too light for someone distant. Her eyes were constantly moving, greeting people, laughing, waving to colleagues, making Daniel feel like a stranger in a territory that should, in some way, also be his. He tried not to be bothered by the way she moved, by how at home she seemed in that place, as if her life had taken on new hues there, far from the home they shared. He watched from afar, holding a glass of wine that had no taste, only served to fill the emptiness in his hands. Laura looked stunning. Her black dress with its subtle back detailing highlighted a confidence that wasn't just aesthetic, it was internal. She was chatting with a group of colleagues when the CEO approached. Tall, with an easy smile, and an imposing posture. Daniel already knew him by name, but it was the first time he'd seen him in person. The man exchanged a few words with her, something relaxed, but with a touch of intimacy that made Daniel subtly tilt his head. He didn't want to be paranoid, but there was something in his gaze, something in the way Laura smiled that seemed different. It was the kind of difference you can't explain with words, but you feel in your gut. They moved away from the group, made their way to the dance floor, and there, amid laughter and a playful exchange of glances, they began to dance. Daniel remained in the corner, motionless. His heart pounded, but his body was inert, as if removed from the scene. They danced slowly, as if the world around them had disappeared. It was intimate, it was light, it was too comfortable to be innocent. When the boss kissed her on the cheek at the end of the song, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. A simple gesture, but out of place. She didn't back away. She smiled. And that was enough. He approached, unhurriedly, as if still giving the universe a chance to disprove him. When he stopped in front of them, the director merely laughed, as if Daniel's presence were a comical interruption. He said he was just dancing, that there was no problem there. But Daniel looked into the eyes of the woman he shared his life with and knew there was. There was something very wrong there. On the way home, the silence between them was unbearable. There was no argument. Not then. Just the roar of the engine and the wind cutting through the empty streets. Once home, she tried to act natural. She said she was tired, that she was going to take a shower, that the party had been intense. But Daniel, his eyes fixed on the empty living room, took a deep breath and asked what was stuck in his throat. He asked if there was something between her and that man. He asked with a firm voice, but his chest in ruins. Laura stopped in the middle of the hallway. Towel in hand, hair tied back, face drawn. She didn't look away. She didn't try to lie. She simply said, "Yes, we are getting involved." The words were spoken in a low, almost respectful tone, as if that would soften the impact. But it was like an internal explosion. Daniel said nothing for a few seconds. He just stood there, staring at what was left of what had once been his home. His entire body ached. Not from the blow, but from the absence. It was as if something had been abruptly ripped from him. The trust, the bond, the identity of an us he still believed existed. She tried to explain, in loose sentences, that it wasn't planned, that everything had just happened, that she'd felt alone for a long time, that routine had suffocated everything. But none of it made sense to him. How could someone who claimed to love become involved with someone else? How could you betray the person who sleeps next to you, who knows your weaknesses, who gives you the best of themselves, even on difficult days? He didn't scream, didn't break anything, didn't cry. He just went upstairs, closed the door, and there, in the dark, sat on the floor, unable to breathe properly. It was as if everything he was had been erased in a second. The next morning, he left early. He left only a letter on the bed. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand anything. He simply wrote what he felt. And he left. With no clear destination, only the desire to get away from everything that, until then, had been his life. Laura spent the next few days torn between work and the silence of the house. The walls seemed taller, time slower. Everything normal had become strange. She missed him, but didn't know how to reconnect what had been severed. Her boss was still there, trying to be supportive, but there was a constant guilt in the air, an unease that grew with each passing hour. She read and reread the letter. "Be happy, whoever you are with, know that I always gave my all for you." And each word weighed like lead. Meanwhile, Daniel moved in temporarily with a friend. He refused advice, avoided conversation. He dove into himself, revisiting every memory, trying to pinpoint the moment when it was no longer enough. He remembered the notes, the dinners, the little surprises, the evening conversations, the glances exchanged without needing to speak. And all of that was now just a memory. Days dragged by. Laura was trying to work as before, but something had changed. Her spark was no longer the same. Meetings felt empty, goals irrelevant. She began to miss something she could never quite name, the calm love, the constant presence, the silent gesture of someone who was always there. She started writing to him. Not letters. Messages she never sent. Notes on her phone, random phrases. Sometimes she remembered a recipe he'd made, a silly comment about a movie, a song he liked. And she cried. She cried because she understood, now, what he meant by giving his all. It was more than gifts and flowers. It was the daily effort of someone who chose to love even when things were hard. Daniel, for his part, didn't seek her out. He began walking every day in the late afternoon. He sat on a park bench, watched the city's activity, listened to other people's conversations, felt the world pulsing outside the bubble he'd lived in. He began writing again. Short stories, reflections, loose texts about love and loss. It was his way of breathing. It was one of those days, sitting in the cafe where he used to work, that a woman approached. Kind, with a calm smile, a light presence. She commented on the book he was reading. They began a simple, unpretentious conversation, without any depth. But it was there, in that brief exchange, that something rekindled. It wasn't love yet. It was just a breath. But sometimes, that's what the soul needs to begin healing. Laura, unaware of any of this, remained immersed in her own choices. She began to realize that the story she was writing wasn't about love, but about error. A mistake that perhaps could never be corrected. And amidst the silence, the guilt, and the absence, an unexpected detail would emerge in the coming days. Something hidden. Something unsaid. A revelation that would completely change the way she viewed everything she'd experienced with him, and everything she'd lost. Time passed without ceremony, without asking permission, like a wind blowing through poorly closed doors. For Daniel, each day was lighter than the last, not because he had forgotten, but because he had learned to let go. The scars were still there, but they no longer burned. His routine had found a new rhythm, quieter, more selective. Little by little, he had rebuilt himself, with pauses, with retreats, with discreet falls and solitary rises. At Clara's side, the woman he met in that café, he found a tenderness that required no explanations, that didn't demand hurried steps, that simply accepted his baggage without trying to empty it. She didn't want to heal him, just hold his hand on the cloudiest days, and that quiet presence spoke louder than 1,000 words. They weren't yet a couple in the traditional sense, but they were building something precious, trust. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be experiencing a kind of time inversion. The days weighed heavily. Mornings were filled with memories, nights with questions. What had once been pride now sounded like an echo. The messages she hadn't sent, the conversations she hadn't tried to have, the times she felt him pulling away and hadn't reached out, all of this now felt like an avalanche. And the more she remembered, the more she understood. What hurt her wasn't just Daniel's absence, but the love she'd wasted, the kind of love you can't find twice with the same intensity. It was on a cold Wednesday night that she decided to look for him. She didn't want to win him back. Or maybe she did, but she didn't know yet. She just felt she needed to see him, hear his voice, even if it was for the last time. He accepted the meeting. He was polite, direct, and straightforward. They met at a park they used to frequent years ago. He arrived first, as always. When he saw her approaching, he felt a slight tightness in his chest, no longer out of love, but out of respect for what they had shared. She seemed smaller, not in size, but in presence. She sat beside him on the wooden bench and said nothing for a few seconds. She just looked at the fallen leaves, the branches dancing in the wind. She took a deep breath and spoke firmly, but without arrogance. She said she was sorry, that she had understood his value too late, that only now did she understand how blind she had been, how lost she had been within herself. Daniel listened in silence. He watched her eyes, not to judge, but to see if there was truth. And there was. He knew it. He felt it. When she finished, she lowered her eyes and waited. He took a deep breath and responded calmly, saying he no longer held any anger. That he had forgiven, yes, but that forgiveness wasn't an invitation to start over. It was simply a mutual release. He said he had suffered greatly, more than he could express in the letter he left. That for a long time he had felt small, not because of her, but because he had given himself completely without being seen. And now that he was rebuilt, there was no room for retreat. Laura tried to hold back her tears, but failed. She said she understood, that she didn't expect anything more, but that she needed to say what she'd been holding onto since the day she found the box in her old apartment. Daniel frowned slightly. He didn't know which box she was talking about. She then explained that, weeks after he left, she returned to the apartment. She wanted to find some memento, some piece of clothing, any trace that would bring him closer to her. And while rummaging through her things, she found a brown cardboard box, hidden in the back of the closet. Inside, dozens of letters. She said she spent an entire night reading them. They were letters written over the years, some short, some long, all addressed to her. Some never delivered. There were love letters, letters of sadness, letters of longing even though they lived under the same roof. Each one revealed a piece of his heart, the struggle, the fear, the exhaustion, the hope. One letter in particular caught her eye. It was the last one. Closed with a simple bow, unlike the others. She hesitated to open it, but curiosity won out. Daniel turned his face away, looking away. He knew which letter it was. Her voice cracked. She said that in that letter he hadn't said anything romantic, nothing poetic. Just one sentence. You never read what I felt, but I read everything you left unsaid. He fell silent. His words, returned by her, now carried a new weight. He hadn't expected her to read it. He'd never intended for that letter to be opened. It was his final outburst, a kind of emotional epitaph. Laura said that when she read that sentence, she fell to the floor and cried like she had never cried before. Because for the first time, she understood that Daniel had been there the whole time, screaming silently, while she lived distracted by an illusion. That he loved her in a way she had never appreciated. Daniel didn't cry. His eyes were moist but firm. He said that letter was written at a time when he already knew there was no turning back. That her betrayal didn't begin with another man's touch, but with the absence of touch when he needed it most. She tried to justify herself, saying she was weak, that she lost her way, that work had consumed her, that her boss had just appeared in a moment of need. But he gently interrupted her, saying he understood. That no one is perfect. That sometimes people make mistakes trying to survive. But that doesn't erase what was done. Laura asked if he'd moved on. He hesitated. He said he'd met someone. He wasn't sure if it was love yet, but it was light, respectful, and sincere. And that, after all, that was what he needed. She nodded. She said she was happy for him, even though her heart was broken. And then, in a courageous gesture, she asked to hug him. He allowed her. And in that embrace, there was no more pressure, pain, or hurt. Just the silent goodbye of two worlds that were once one. When she pulled away, she smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and said she would keep those letters forever. He replied that she could keep them. That perhaps, one day, they would help her understand that love isn't noise, it's presence. They said goodbye with a discreet wave. Each followed a different path through the park. And as the wind rustled the leaves above, the last page of that story turned, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the painful beauty of a new beginning born where love wasn't enough for two. But something was yet to come. Something Laura would discover days later, something hidden not in written words, but in silent gestures that went unnoticed. Something that would explain much of what she had never understood, until now. The end of that encounter in the park seemed to seal their story with a bittersweet maturity. The steps that went in opposite directions carried not only the weight of their farewell, but also the complexity of feelings that could no longer be translated into words. Laura, even after having said what she had kept inside, still felt the echo of his absence within her. And despite the embrace, the permission, the honesty between them, something still hammered at her mind. There was a restlessness that wouldn't go away, a feeling that not everything had been said. She already had the letters, the final sentence tattooed on her memory, but there was one detail that haunted her from the moment she left Daniel's apartment that night, the red envelope. It was the only item that didn't match the rest of the box. While all the other letters were on white sheets or in old notebooks, the red envelope was sealed, nameless, undated, just tucked into a corner, as if it didn't want to be read. Laura didn't have the courage to open it that day. She tucked it away among her things, perhaps afraid of what she might find there. But that night, after their reunion in the park, something inside her demanded to know. She needed to understand. If there was something else Daniel had written, she wanted to read it, even if it was painful. He sat on his bed, turned on the lamp beside him, and with trembling hands, broke the seal. Inside was a carefully folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter like the others. It was a raw outpouring. An account of a specific night. The night Daniel had come home from work early, a little over a year ago, and found something he'd never mentioned. That day, he had planned a special dinner. There was no occasion. It was just an ordinary Tuesday, but he wanted to surprise her. He had stopped at the market, bought her favorite wine, and prepared her favorite recipe. But when he got home, he heard laughter coming from upstairs. He thought about sneaking upstairs, getting everything ready before she noticed. He walked up the stairs with light steps and, upon reaching his bedroom, found the door ajar. Inside, Laura was on the phone, lying on the bed, laughing in a tone he hadn't heard in months. Her words were light, teasing. She was speaking to someone who clearly wasn't a friend. She said she missed him, that the day had been busy, but that she wanted to see him soon. And most devastatingly, she said Daniel would never know, that it was only a matter of time until everything would work out. He didn't come in. He didn't confront her. He went downstairs in silence, put away the wine, threw away the dinner, and went out for a walk without a destination. He returned late. He said he had a last-minute meeting. He slept facing the opposite side, like so many other nights. On the paper, he wrote that that night was the beginning of the end. That from that moment on, he stopped fighting for a us that no longer existed. But it wasn't out of cowardice that he didn't say anything. He wanted her to have the chance to recognize herself, to look in the mirror and see who she had become. Reading that, Laura felt a burning shame. Knowing that he already knew, that he had witnessed it, that he had felt it all so silently, it was unbearable. Even more so was understanding that he had chosen not to destroy her with anger, that he had chosen silence over humiliation, that he had endured the pain with a dignity she never would have been able to offer if the roles had been reversed. Deep down, she hoped that by confessing the affair on the day of the party, she had been honest. Now she understood that the true act of honesty had been his, in continuing to be good even when he had already been broken inside. In the following days, Laura withdrew from everything. She took leave from work, avoided contact, and declined invitations. She needed to breathe, think, and organize everything she had been accumulating. She spent hours sitting on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by letters, as if trying to piece together a puzzle from the past. Each passage, each sentence, each written silence revealed how much she had ignored the signs, how much she had lost herself, how much she had traded love for vanity. Daniel, on the other hand, was in a completely different phase. His bond with Clara had deepened organically. There were no promises, no grandiose plans. But there was a lightness. They saw each other a few times a week, sometimes in silence, sometimes with long conversations about life, art, fear, and the future. She truly listened to him, and more than that, she didn't demand anything more from him than he could give. It was a relationship built on scars, not expectations. On a cloudy Saturday afternoon, Laura decided to do something she'd been putting off for days. She wanted to hand him the red envelope. She felt she needed to show him she knew. Not to reverse anything, but because he deserved to hear from her that she now understood the full extent of what he'd silently carried. She knocked on the door of his new apartment, the one where he had started his life over. Clara answered. There was a natural, effortless serenity about her. She was different from Laura in every way except her eyes. There was pain in them, but of a different nature. Daniel came in soon after. The surprised expression was followed by a calm wave. Laura handed him the folded envelope, explained that she had already read it, that she knew everything, and that she just wanted him to know that she understood now. She apologized again, but in a deeper way, without trying to win him back. It was a farewell that came from the soul. Clara, respectful, retreated to the kitchen. Daniel invited Laura in. They sat in the living room. She spoke of the impact the letter had had, how profound it had been, how she never imagined someone could carry so much pain without ever returning it with resentment. Daniel listened to her with unblinking eyes, but without judgment. He said that for a long time, he believed silence was cowardice. Today, he saw that it was the most honest way he could find to preserve what remained of them both. Laura smiled, a sad, resigned smile. She said he was the kind of man who deserved true love, and that she hoped, from the bottom of her heart, that Clara would be that love. Daniel thanked her, touched by the maturity of the moment. Before leaving, she took one last look around. It was a home, different from the one they had built, but still full of affection. She said she understood now. She understood the value of someone who gives their all, even when they no longer receive. Daniel walked her to the door. The hug was brief, but filled with everything that couldn't be put into words. When she pulled away and walked away, he stood there for a moment, feeling a strange relief, as if he'd finally laid a ghost to rest. Clara returned to the living room and sat beside him. She didn't ask anything, just held his hand. He smiled, a new smile, of someone no longer carrying the weight of the past. And in that moment, without promises, without plans, without guarantees, he realized that sometimes life doesn't need to start over with a bang. Sometimes it just needs to continue, peacefully. But as night fell, and the city lights slowly came on, one last letter still waited to be written. Not by him, nor by her. But by life, which always finds a way to close cycles where love was sincere, even when it was interrupted. Their farewell, though final, didn't mean absence. Traces of each other still lingered within, in places that time or distance couldn't erase. Those memories, though silent, were like scars that no longer bled but remained sensitive to the touch. After the delivery of the red envelope, their last honest conversation, Laura seemed to have changed not only the way she saw Daniel, but the way she saw herself. Something inside her had been irreversibly broken, and it wasn't pride, it was the illusion that one could live ignoring love when it knocks on the door every day, when it cooks dinner, when it leaves notes, when it remains silent instead of hurting. For the first time in a long time, she felt regret not as a weight that shrank her, but as a cruel mirror that showed her what she had been unable to see. At home, everything was emptier now, not just because of Daniel's physical absence, but because of the constant presence of what he represented and no longer existed. The stack of letters remained there, stored, not as a romantic collection, but as a testament to what had been ignored. Laura didn't know what to do with it. Part of her wanted to keep it forever, as a personal punishment, another part wanted to get rid of it, to try to move on. But how could she move on when everything left behind still screamed? The nights became long again. The messages on her phone, which had previously been from her boss, her friends, the company, now seemed more distant, as if the world had slowed down so she could feel the pain she had tried to avoid for so long. On the other side of this story, Daniel was going through a quieter, but no less profound, process. The serenity he felt with Clara wasn't the kind of explosive love he'd experienced with Laura. It was a love that grew silently, like a plant slowly blooming after a harsh winter. Clara was patient, observant, and knew how to read the silences without pressing for words. It was clear that she, too, carried scars, and perhaps that was why they understood each other so much without needing to say so. With her, Daniel didn't need to justify himself. He didn't need to prove how much he gave of himself. He was seen, simply seen, and that, after everything he'd been through, was the closest he'd ever been to peace. But a dilemma slowly crept in. Laura, even after everything, was still part of his journey. She was the longest, most intense, most painful chapter. And this left a shadow that was difficult to erase. Even though Clara didn't show discomfort, even though she never demanded or questioned him, Daniel felt a silent guilt within himself. Not for loving Clara, but for still being moved by the past. There were days when he remembered small moments with Laura, banal situations that now took on symbolic weight. A silent breakfast, a conversation in the car, a late afternoon walk. These memories came not with longing for what they had experienced, but with a kind of mourning for what could have been. And it was in this context that the moral dilemma began to emerge: how to move on completely when part of you was still tied to a story that didn't have a fair ending. Laura had been forgiven, they had talked, but there was still a silence that lingered between the lines of what was never said. Daniel wondered if he had done the right thing by not confronting her that day, by choosing silence, by choosing to leave without destroying. Would it have been fairer to himself to explode, to speak out, to demand explanations? Or would it have been crueler? This doubt haunted him subtly but constantly. Clara, sensing something was bothering him, decided to propose something unexpected. She told him that if there was still something unresolved with Laura, he should resolve it. She spoke with the firmness of someone unafraid of loss, because she understands the value of what she offers. She didn't speak out of insecurity, but out of empathy. She said she loved the way he treated her, but that she didn't want to be with someone who still carried internal ties. Daniel hadn't expected that. He felt small in the face of her generosity, and at the same time, deeply touched. He didn't know how to respond. The following week, after much thought, he decided to write one last letter. Not to reopen wounds, nor to fuel hope. It was an emotional farewell letter. An apology for everything he hadn't said, for everything he hadn't faced, for choosing silence when perhaps he should have been a storm. It was also a letter of gratitude, because even with all her flaws, Laura had been part of the making of who he was now. And ultimately, it was a letter of liberation, to himself. He arranged one last meeting with her. This time, not in old places, but in a new, neutral space, where nothing connected them to the past. When she arrived, she knew something was different. He was calm, no longer carrying any grudges. When he delivered the letter, he said he didn't expect a reply. He said that now, finally, he could move forward without burden, without guilt, and that he hoped she could too. Laura received the letter with trembling hands. She wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. She simply nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. They hugged again. A shorter but deeper hug. When she let go, he was already far away, not in his steps, but in his soul. That night, alone in her apartment, Laura read the letter. She wept silently. But it was no longer a cry of despair. It was a cry of acceptance. She knew she had lost him forever, and she knew it was fair. For the first time, she accepted that not everything can be fixed. That some choices are like burning bridges. And that, even so, one must carry on. Daniel returned home and found Clara sitting on the sofa, reading a book. She smiled when she saw him, a small smile that said more than any question. He sat beside her, took her hand, and there, without needing to explain anything, they both knew that a new cycle was truly beginning. The past no longer needed a voice. And the future, for the first time in a long time, seemed light. But while peace finally began to settle in the two hearts that had once been at war, one final choice still awaited. Something Laura would have to decide alone. Something that didn't involve Daniel, nor guilt, nor return. Only herself, before a mirror that didn't lie. And it was in this choice that the true ending of that story would begin to take shape. Laura spent days with the letter on her coffee table, folded with precision, as if the paper held an emotional bomb she wasn't ready to detonate. She didn't read it all at once. She preferred to open it in small snippets, absorbing each word like someone savoring something they know will burn in their throat. There was a different weight there, not of condemnation, but of closure. Daniel's words weren't like the first letters, full of pent-up anguish or frustrated love. There was no hurt, just a firm serenity, like someone who found a dignified end within themselves, without needing the other to fully understand. He was talking about rebuilding, about finding clarity in silence, about how forgiveness isn't a gesture for others, but a relief you give yourself. And Laura, as she read, felt an indigestible mixture of admiration and shame, as if she could finally see herself not through the eyes of the mistake she made, but through the eyes of the other who endured everything, and who was now leaving forever. The weeks that followed were like a transitional period. Nothing happened immediately, but everything was in flux. Laura returned to work, but with a different attitude. She no longer spoke with the same enthusiasm, nor carried the same tone of self-confidence. She kept her schedule, delivered what was required, but no longer cared about standing out. She wasn't seeking redemption in productivity. She was there out of obligation, no longer ambition. Conversations with her boss became brief, strictly professional, and little by little, she distanced herself from the routine that had previously absorbed her completely. There was no resentment, just a natural distance, as if it had all grown old within her, without the strength to begin again. One morning, as she crossed a busy street, Laura stopped in her tracks, as if something had stopped her insides. She looked around, observing the rush of people, the noise of cars, the indifferent faces. She felt disconnected from everything. What was she doing there? Where was she going in such a hurry? What was the point of this routine if, inside her, everything seemed paralyzed? She returned home, took off her shoes in the middle of the living room, and sat on the floor, feeling the weight of her own absence. She was alive, but not present in her own life. For the first time, she felt she no longer knew who she was without Daniel, without her job, without the role of someone desired or admired. It was as if she had spent years molding herself to others' expectations, and now, with no one around, there was no form left. At the end of that week, she decided to visit her parents, something she hadn't done in months. He arrived unannounced, taking them by surprise. Her mother, overcome with emotion, ran to hug her. Her father, restrained as always, only held her hand for a few seconds before pulling away. They sat in the backyard, as they used to, unhurriedly. They talked about trivialities, about the neighbor who moved, about the puppy who was getting old, about the rain that had been delaying. Laura, silent, simply listened, absorbing the simplicity of their exchanges. At one point, her mother looked her in the eye and said that sometimes the worst punishment life inflicts isn't the one that comes from others, but the one that comes from within. He said he recognized that pain because he had felt it too, many years ago. He said everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone has the courage to face them head-on. Laura held back her tears as best she could, but ended up collapsing in her mother's lap, like when she was a child. She cried without saying anything. She just cried. That visit was the first real attempt to reconnect with who she was before. Upon returning home, she began to change small things. She took down the old photos with Daniel from the wall, not out of anger, but out of respect for the new phase. She donated clothes, rearranged furniture, and changed the plants on the balcony. She began writing in a notebook every day, even if only to record what she had felt or dreamed. It was a slow but honest effort. She wasn't seeking redemption in the eyes of others, she simply wanted to find some peace within herself. Daniel, meanwhile, continued his life with Clara, but without rushing to label what they were experiencing. He still carried the care of someone who has been hurt, but also the generosity of someone who has allowed themselves to trust again. Clara, patient, didn't demand grand gestures, and so he offered them spontaneously. They went out on Sundays, walked to markets, made simple plans. Sometimes, they just sat in silence, reading books on the same sofa. It was a different kind of relationship, less intense, more solid. And yet, deeply affectionate. One afternoon, over coffee at a bakery, Clara told him she'd received a job offer in another city, an opportunity that could change her career. She didn't want to make a decision without talking to him. She said she loved what they were building, but that she wouldn't give up her personal projects for fear of alienating someone. Daniel was silent for a few moments, staring at the cup in front of him. He said that if she went, he would understand. That he would never make her choose between love and her life. And that if it was meant to be, they would find a way. Clara, with a calm smile, replied that that was precisely why she loved him. That conversation wasn't a breakup, but a turning point. In the following days, Daniel began to reflect on the kind of love he was experiencing now. It wasn't the same as the one he'd had with Laura, and it didn't need to be. There was no longer room for comparison. There was only a present that demanded attention and a future that required courage. He realized he was more ready than he'd imagined to embrace the new, even if it meant adjustments, changes, and new beginnings outside his comfort zone. Meanwhile, Laura was making an important decision. She had been invited to give a lecture on internal communications at a university. It would be a small attendance event, but it represented something that, for her, meant more than just an invitation. It was a chance to reconnect with her own voice. During the lecture, she spoke clearly, firmly, but also with a more mature outlook. At the end, she was applauded not only for her ideas but also for her emotional delivery. Among those present, a student approached and thanked her, saying she had never heard anyone speak with such humanity about mistakes and new beginnings. That night, when she got home, Laura sat on the sofa, lit a candle, and wrote something in the notebook she had been filling. True love is the kind that continues even when the other person leaves, because it leaves lessons that no one else can teach. She knew that sentence wasn't just about Daniel, but about what she had become after him. And it was during this process of rebirth that she received an unexpected email. It was from Clara. A simple, respectful message. She said she had no intention of reopening wounds, but that she felt it was only right to write. She said she and Daniel were doing well, that they were making plans. And she said, with disconcerting sincerity, that she admired Laura for having the courage to turn back, to seek out Daniel, to face her own mistakes. The message ended with a sentence that lingered in Laura's mind for days: "The pain you went through allowed us to find each other. And I sincerely hope you too find someone who sees you the right way." Laura didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just saved the message in a folder and closed her computer. She felt no jealousy, no envy, no anger. She felt an unexpected relief. There was no more war inside her. The guilt hadn't turned into punishment, but into learning. And that was the quietest freedom she could wish for. The next morning, looking out the window, she saw a new day begin, not as a metaphor, but as a fact. The street was busy, the sun cut through the buildings, the world moved on. For the first time in a long time, she took a deep breath and felt that she, too, could move on. And she knew that wherever that path led, she would no longer walk as someone repentant and seeking forgiveness, but as someone transformed by the pain of having lost what she once failed to care for. And yet, deserving of starting over. The months that followed seemed to push each character in a direction that inevitably led them to the destiny they themselves had paved. Daniel, now with a lighter soul and a whole heart, finally accepted the job offer he had been rejecting for years, to coordinate an editorial project outside the city, something that combined his passion for writing, silence, and freedom. The new routine was not urgent, but it had purpose. He and Clara rented a small house in a coastal town, surrounded by tall trees and cobblestone streets where time seemed to pass more slowly. There was no formal proposal, no exchange of rings, but there was a silent pact of loyalty and presence. Each morning was built slowly, with hot coffee and glances that said, "We are here, and that is enough." Daniel no longer sought to prove love, and Clara didn't need to demand it. The lightness between them was a reflection of pain transformed into maturity, of trauma transmuted into wisdom. For the first time, he felt that he no longer needed to carry the weight of the past, and that loving someone was allowing the other to breathe without suffocating. Meanwhile, Laura had also quit her job. Not out of impulsiveness, but because she no longer recognized herself in that environment where everything began to fall apart. She opened a small consulting firm, working independently, with a limited number of clients and enough time to focus on her own mental health. She left her apartment for a smaller space, away from everything that reminded her of what she'd lost. The new home was simpler, quieter, and lacked the luster of the past, but it also didn't hurt. Daniel's letters were kept in a sealed wooden box and placed high in the closet. It was no longer an object of torment, but of memory. She knew it was part of history, but she no longer needed to reread it to understand. He wrote frequently, no longer as a form of self-punishment, but as a way to reorganize his soul. She felt more whole each week, though she knew true peace wouldn't come quickly. There were still long nights, there were still unanswered questions, but now she knew how to sit next to the pain, face it, and then let it go. On a cloudy Saturday, Laura received an invitation to participate in an event on emotional ethics in professional relationships. She hesitated for a few days, but accepted. On the day of the talk, she wore a light dress, her hair tied back, and subtle makeup. She took the stage and told her story without names, without intimate details, but with heartbreaking truths. She spoke of betrayal, of guilt, of how one mistake can erode years of love. But she also spoke of the value of honest repentance, of personal reconstruction, of the responsibility of accepting consequences. The auditorium remained silent from beginning to end, and at the end, she received a standing ovation not with euphoric applause, but with understanding looks. Someone in the audience wept silently. Another smiled tenderly. Everyone there had experienced or caused some pain, and her words echoed like a mirror. Leaving the event, Laura walked alone through the nearby streets, feeling the fresh air on her face. In the window of a small bookstore, she saw a book by Daniel on display. It was his first published novel, released discreetly weeks before. There was a dedication on the back cover, for those who loved and failed. And still deserve a new beginning. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She felt neither envy nor frustration. She felt pride. Of him, and, curiously, of herself. Because even with everything, she had learned to carry what she had done without denying, without running away, without transferring. And most importantly, without romanticizing it. On the other side, Daniel also heard about the talk. A mutual friend had sent him the link to the recording. He watched it alone, one afternoon when Clara had gone to visit her parents. He watched it from beginning to end, with a calm heart. In every sentence, he recognized the woman he'd once shared dreams with. Not the same one who betrayed him, but the one he'd loved before that. And in the end, he didn't cry. He simply closed his laptop, went to the balcony, and gazed at the sea. Clara arrived shortly after, leaned against the doorframe, and said he had a different outlook on his life. He smiled and replied that yes, sometimes the past says goodbye silently. And that day, he let it go for good. A few years later, their paths would cross again, but unintentionally. It was a literary festival in a neighboring town, where they were both guests at different tables. Daniel was accompanied by Clara, now his wife, with whom he had a 2-year-old son named Miguel, who ran between the chairs and drew discreet smiles from those present. Laura arrived alone, but with a confident posture, well-groomed gray hair, and a look that no longer held pain, only stories. When they saw each other, there was no tension. A slight nod, a gentle smile. Both understood that this moment was not a reunion, but a peaceful ending that life had chosen to write. During her talk, Daniel listened from the back of the audience. She spoke about forgiveness and reconnecting with inner truth. She quoted a passage from one of his old texts, without mentioning names, but enough to let him know she remembered. After the event, they spent a few minutes together. He introduced Clara naturally. Laura shook her hand sincerely and then bent down to joke with Miguel, asking his age, receiving a shy smile in response. Daniel and Laura chatted briefly about the event, the weather, and the life that followed. When she said goodbye, he thanked her, not for anything specific, just for everything. And she understood. On the way home, Clara asked if he was okay. He said yes, that he felt whole. That there were no more holes inside him. And that, looking at his son sleeping in the back seat, he knew that everything, even the pain, had brought him here. She squeezed his hand, and in silence, they continued down the road. Laura, alone in her car, turned on the radio and let the music fill the space. She no longer thought about starting over with anyone. There was no rush. She knew that if love ever came again, she would treat it as she should have treated the first. But if it didn't, she would also be at peace. She had found herself after all, and that was more than she ever hoped to achieve. And so, each went their own way. Daniel, with a new family built on respect and truth. Laura, with a more honest life, understanding that regret doesn't erase mistakes but can illuminate futures. And Clara, with the generosity of someone who knows how to love someone who has been broken, but who never stopped deserving love. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Do you think Daniel made the right decisions? Did Laura deserve a second chance? And Clara, how did you see her role in this journey? Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, real, intense, and that make us reflect on what it truly means to love. And never forget, cheating isn't just a mistake, it's a choice with profound consequences. It destroys not only marriages, but also trust, admiration, peace, and the most valuable thing between two people, respect. This channel does not support, romanticize, or justify any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show that those who truly love, care. And those who choose to cheat won't always have the chance to go back.